Hello everyone, Ruby Ravel here, a prattling Proteus of peripatetic polarities, here to talk to you today about Sun in Gemini. Now I want to explore the symbolism of and meaning of these two chatty twins by seeing how they build upon and attempt to synthesize and combine and overcome the limitations of the first two signs of the zodiac, because the full journey through the 12 signs all depict the gradual cycle of man's development and all the different, increasingly complex and refined skills that he needs to develop to confront the problem that is life, and all of the different characters, odysseys, trials and tribulations that we encounter along the way. So when we begin with Aries, ruled by Mars, then life is a fight. It is a competition for resources in which we need to prove our superiority over someone else to get what we want. It is directed towards the will. And next we have Taurus, which says, well, instead of fighting people for resources and competing with them, instead I'm going to try and harmonize with them. I'm going to try and get along with them. I'm going to try and share with them, but also clearly define what belongs to who. What's mine and what's yours. Begin by putting some earthy boundaries and structures in place. But in this sense, they represent two of the poles of masculine and feminine, with Aries being pure, undifferentiated masculine fire, and Taurus representing feminine, undifferentiated earth. These elements both in their most basic, immediate, and unrefined form in terms of how they respond to life. And if we just live totally through the Aryan point of view in that constant rush of fire, then we are at risk of never stopping, of never having anywhere where our momentum can rest, of life just being this constant fist fight, of there being no equilibrium or restraint to pull that fire back. Whereas with the energies of Taurus, we have the opposite problem, where things may become so comfortable and still and quiet and harmonious and relaxed that they may become stagnant and reach this point of absolute entropy. So one is fiery and too fast, the other is cumbersome and too slow. But the fact that life has tried to learn these opposites is where Gemini comes in, where it begins to realize that rather than committing to one polarity or the other, it can switch between both according to the needs of the situation, and it can learn to synthesize both as well. And this is why Mercury, the ruler of Gemini, is known for having his wand, the caduceus, in which you have the snakes inwoven in a helical pattern, because they are representing the power of the mind to entertain opposites simultaneously and mediate between them. Rather than just choosing one or the other, it represents that these two things can be a merging of ingredients that can help us deal with a more refined approach to life that seeks to understand it and communicate with life rather than just trying to have some kind of effect upon it. So Gemini, being the first mutable sign, realizes that it doesn't have to commit to just one way of approaching life, that it can be flexible, it can be adaptable, that it can shapeshift and rearrange itself according to the needs of different situations. You know, being intellectual and being analytical, it looks over at Aries, constantly getting into fights and being on the warpath about different things, and it can say to itself, well, you know, I can see there are some situations where there's appropriate, but there's others where, you know, Aries is just creating unnecessary trouble and turmoil for themselves. I'm not sure I really want to go down that route. And then it looks over at Taurus lazing around, eating some donuts and, being serenaded by a lover. And it says, well, that also looks like a really pleasant way of being, but it also looks a bit static and dull. It was completely given into. Surely it must be a case that I could find these two personas within myself and then switch between them according to as and when they are necessary. It realizes that it can combine polarities within itself, that it can flit between opposites, that it can try on different personalities and alternate between them so that it is responding agreeably to the environment rather than always imposing itself upon the environment. It's like the world talks to it and Gemini talks back. And through that process, a little bit of the world enters into it and a little bit of itself enters back into the world, so that there is this give and take of influence rather than a too solid encasing of the self. So whereas Aries is me versus the world, me fighting the world. Taurus is me with the world, sharing pleasure and taking pleasure from the world. Gemini is investigating and exploring and communicating and striving to understand the world through communicating with the world, through identifying with it intellectually and experimenting with the logical deductions of whatever it observes. So it may go over to Aries and ask Aries why it functions the way it is, why its behavior and mannerisms are that way. And as it listens to Aries explain itself, it nods and says, oh yeah, I really get that. I can see that in myself too. Oh yeah, oh me, I'm exactly the same. Then it goes over to Taurus, has the same conversation, asks it the same questions, interrogates it on all of these different matters. And it says, oh yeah, Taurus, yeah, well, I'm exactly the same as well. I can also see that in me. And to people on the outside, that might look like Gemini is being deceitful or two-faced or dishonest or deceptive, when actually it just has the capacity to identify wholeheartedly with things that seem mutually exclusive, but through the magical wand of Caduceus, through the hermetic phallus of Mercury, it is able to combine into a unity that is greater than the sum of its parts. So while Aries and Taurus both have to navigate the other out there, Gemini realizes that the other out there also exists within, that everyone that it is interacting with in some way represents its own personal inner inconsistency, which by its very definition becomes its consistency. So let's just try a stupid little thought experiment for a moment, if you'll indulge me. Let's say that Aries and Taurus and Gemini are all sitting together out in a beautiful woodland clearing, when suddenly, out of nowhere, bread descends from heaven. This beautiful, shining, golden loaf of bread just descends from the skies and lands into the center of the field. And Aries looks at this heavenly sent bread and says, I want that bread. That bread should be mine, and I'm gonna fight anyone who says otherwise. Come on, who wants to fight over the bread? And instantly starts putting up its fists and trying to goad people into some kind of action. And Taurus kind of groans at this and thinks that, oh God, Aries is being dramatic and making a bit of a scene again, and says, well, actually, Aries, I think you'll find that this woodland clearing belongs to me. I have the deeds of right to it, so anything that lands on my property belongs to me. However, if you are nice to me, I may share it with you because I care about you. And then Gemini thinks, well, actually, I want to understand this bread. Why did it come from heaven? What was its purpose? What is it made of? What are the ingredients? Who baked this loaf of bread? But What is bread anyway? What is the actual concept of bread? How long have we been making bread? There must be many different types of making bread, you know. I'm sure they don't all come in this shape. There must be different permutations and transmutations and manifestations of them. So rather than sticking around with these two bozos trying to, you know, argue who gets to eat the bread, I'd rather, you know, understand the very nature and quintessence of bread itself. So I'm going to go on a little journey. I'm going to go to all of the local neighborhoods and communities and just ask them to tell me everything they know about bread. And if there's a library nearby, I'll pop in. If there's a baker, I'll get him to show me all the different types. And then after that, I'll come back and I'll tell Aries and Taurus everything I know. And they almost certainly will not give a crap, because they'll either have fought each other to the death or eaten it by then. So the purpose of Gemini in the succession of the zodiac is to get things moving again after the absolute stasis of Taurus. Taurus, being undifferentiated earth, values sameness and stability and predictability and routine. And once it has found an area in life that satisfies its pleasures and basic needs, then it is inclined to stay there unless something manages to shift this increasingly immovable obstacle. So if we imagine Taurus as the cow grazing in the field, if it has its field where it knows grass will keep growing and all of the hedgerows will keep enemies out and keep safety and pleasure and the rest of its herd in, then it's fine. It doesn't need anything else. Everything else is right here in this field. But then Gemini is born, and within a day of being born, it asks and it investigates the field, it analyzes every last part of it, it distinguishes between all of the different trees and shrubs that make up the patternation of the hedgerows. It derives Latin names for the grass. It asks for the names of everything else and writes the dictionary and lexicon upon them. It looks over at the river and understands all the species of fish in it. And then eventually it gets bored. It thinks, well, you know, I've analysed all this pretty thoroughly and quickly and figured out names about everything and derived as much wisdom and knowledge as I can from everyone who's existing in this field. But my deductions lead me to believe that there are other fields and landscapes beyond this one. So it speaks to Taurus and it says, well, you know, so what's beyond this field? If I cross over that stile there or leave that gate, what's beyond? And Taurus shrugs its shoulders and says, why should I care? You know, this is my field. I've got it made. I don't need to go anywhere else. And Gemini thinks, well, if I stick around here, I'm not going to learn anything new. I'll just keep going round and round the same pieces of information over and over again. I need something new. I need something to keep my mind going, because otherwise my mind will turn upon itself. And those two polarities that I feel constantly switching between me, instead of merging together harmoniously as lovers, will instead start fighting one another. I need to go out into the world and explore places that I've never seen and go into other neighborhoods and environments and then contrast them with this one, because one of the ways it learns is by comparing things, by making analytical deductions about how things differ, of looking at the details that separate one thing from another and then seeing how they are related conceptually and intellectually. But Gemini also sets himself up in antithesis to the fixed nature of Taurus that has a tendency to say, this is who I am, this is what I like, and this is what I dislike, and nothing about that will change. And those are concrete expressions of my identity, which will remain forevermore. No matter what changes and vagaries and vacillations go on around me, I will be this stalwart pillar that will be a symbol of something enduring and lasting in face of the trivial fluctuations of the outer world. Whereas Gemini says, I don't want to set myself up as someone who is acting as an enclosure against the environment. I want to be influenced by the environment, and I want the environment to influence me back. I want to be receptive to what I can learn from all the details and information and facts and data around me, but I also want to share those back, because I appreciate how greatly changes in perception and new informations have managed to expand my awareness of the world, and I want to give that back and derive some kind of status and prestige from my capacity to make people's minds a little more light and a little more interesting. But this is why Gemini is such a social butterfly, because even though it recognizes that there are opposites existing within it, that there is a degree to which it can identify and see itself intellectually in everyone that it meets, the complexity and the multiplicity of juggling all of those different mentalities can make it indecisive, erratic, and can struggle to commit to just one thing when all these different variables and possibilities all look so exciting in their own right. So if it meets other people who have a definition of character against which it can contrast itself, then it can have a stronger idea of what it actually feels. And that feeling may change from partnership to partnership, from friend to friend, but even temporarily having someone else who can be the polarity against which its own opposite recognizes itself can make the process of actually engaging with life easier, because with its endless analyzing and theorizing and looking at things in the world, if it just has to keep that all in its head, then it's inclined to just either spiral off messily and haphazardly in different directions, or to just keep going round and round in a circle like a feedback loop. And this isn't exciting for Gemini, because then it means it's not generating any new knowledge, it's not increasing its awareness, there's no new data coming in, just an endless reshuffling of the data that it already has. Where if it's constantly going out into the world, engaging with new people, meeting new people, seeing new things, then it's always receiving new data that it can then test and compare and operate against what it already knows. So it's keeping itself moving, it's keeping itself open and receptive to the world. It's not at risk of stagnating or being pulled back into the ponderosity of Taurus. It's keeping things lively and moving and pulsating in different directions, rather than giving it this sense of eternal rootedness, which to it would feel like imprisonment. It is instead giving itself a sensation of freedom and liberty and low-level expansion by keeping the possibility of change an ever-present thing. It's not one of these things that wants change every now and then. It needs bursts of constant change to keep it in flow with the breezes and expostulations of the world, rather than falling back into a stillness, a mental stillness that to Gemini would be tantamount to death. Now, Sun in Gemini is really being pushed and pulled about, or rather significantly weighed down or drawn underground at the moment, because it is still in applying square to Saturn in Pisces and trining Pluto in Aquarius. And whilst Sun in Gemini is buzzing around saying, oh, the world is such an interesting, fascinating place. I just want to know everyone and speak to everyone and learn about everything, and then have conversations about what I've learned and use it to make new friends, or to have new business ideas or travel plans that will take me to new places and keep introducing me to new parts of the world. It comes across Saturn in Pisces, who says, well, what's the point? You know, no matter how much we learn, no matter how highly we develop our intellect, no matter how witty and intelligent or vivacious we are, or how great our powers of analysis can be, it will not prevent us from experiencing suffering and loss and the ultimate self-sacrifice that the universe will inevitably put us through. And this is a bit staggering to Sun in Gemini, which is trying to fly around and keep buzzing and lively, and instead Saturn is saying, I'm going to squash you, little butterfly, because it's better off that you just submit to the inevitable misery of life now than permit yourself just to keep struggling vainly with the illusory nature of existence. And Gemini, to be honest, isn't really concerned that much with whether reality is an illusion or not. So long as the illusion is interesting and entertaining and fascinating and inspiring its curiosity, then it's quite happy to look at that mechanism. So even though Saturn weighs it down with its ponderosity and its heavy, burdensome emotions that have a tendency to get the light wings of Gemini waterlogged and wet to the point where it doesn't feel it can fly or flit about in as carefree and excitable manner as it would prefer, it can still ask questions to Saturn in Pisces. It can still say, well, why do you feel that way? What can we do about this melancholia you're experiencing? What can we do about the lack of control you feel about life? Is there a deeper pattern or web that we can explore to help look at, the forces that are making these things happen and be experienced about you? This could be an opportunity to go into therapy or to have deeper conversations with someone. And to a degree, that's also the case of the trine with Pluto, whereas Gemini likes to flip busily around between many things, doing this kind of constant loop and cycle and investigation of everything with its environment, Pluto wants Gemini to look deeper. Rather than just being concerned with the trivial surface manifestations of things, it wants it to penetrate below the surface, to look at the deep psychological and sociological factors that take place and which unconsciously to us a lot of the time are governing our behaviours and mannerisms and responses to life. And whilst that heavy single-pointedness that Pluto demands can feel like a challenge and a restriction and a threat to the light-hearted busyness of the Gemini nature, Gemini can still look at what Pluto in Aquarius is saying about the depth psychology and the mysteries of the mind and say, well, that's actually really fucking fascinating. That would be interesting to explore and to have conversations with people about the deep buried primordial parts of themselves that are secretly calling the shots, and what we can do about those to have interesting conversations with people that could actually end up bringing us closer together. Anyway, that was all messy. What do you want, Gemini is interested in having lots of ideas, not necessarily in building rigid, everlasting systems from them. That's more the domain of Aquarius, or on a more practical level, Virgo, and on a more religious, spiritual level of Sagittarius. Gemini is just the basic investigatory nature that gets things going and starts asking questions about life and pulls up all the data, which probably someone with more patience and determination will later find a way of doing something with. Anyway, have I said enough for now? Has Gemini ever said enough? I don't know, but I'm going to stop the video there if my tongue will permit me. I hope you've enjoyed it, in spite of the messiness and the mercuriality of it all. If you need to get in touch with your Mercuries and send me an email if you want any kind of spiritual counselling or guidance, please contact me at thestarsunraveled@outlook.com. You can follow me on Instagram at Astrology in Underwear. You can support me on Patreon at www.patreon.com/thestarsunraveled. Or you can look to the skies with your binoculars and see what heavenly loaves of bread are flitting about like baked goods versions of UFOs and wonder, where did they come from? Where will they go now?